are enormous numbers. There is an enormous number of positive trends. And I want to talk about several of them that should encourage us and that would, I think, help us to understand why the present actually looks a lot better than the recent past did for Palestinian Americans and for the Palestine cause in this country. The first thing is that, fortunately, alhamdulillah, young people in this country, by and large, are smarter, more worldly, better informed, and less bigoted than their parents. Yes, there are young ignoramuses who are bigots in the United States, lots of them. But by and large, the younger generation is far better informed, far more worldly, far more interested in learning languages, far less reliant on mainstream corporate media, and much more able through social media, through alternative media, to get an unbiased and an objective picture of reality. And that includes their understanding of Palestine. I have been year by year surprised and pleased by the changes that I've seen in the student body that I teach year in, year out. I teach some of the same courses, and every year I'm surprised how much better the kids are in terms of their understanding of the world, of the Middle East, and also of Palestine. And this is a change that's been going on for many, many years, and it's a very strong trend. Young people are much, much more amenable to an objective view of Palestine than were their elders. A second important change, and this is something that's happened, it's exploded since the Black Lives Matter movement developed. You can take it back to Ferguson, you can take it back further. I mean, this has roots back in the 60s, actually. The connection with other minorities in this country, between Muslim Americans, between Palestinian Americans, between Arab Americans, and Blacks, and Latinos, and other indigenous peoples, is infinitely stronger today and has much more substance to it than it ever had in the past. These are groups, some of which actually have some clout within the society, even though they're minorities, even though in many cases they suffer from structural, visceral, racist hatred. They have some assets that we don't yet have. And I think it's very, very important to understand that in many cases, they are much more alive or are becoming more alive to the fact that some of the things that affect Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans in this country, some of the prejudice, some of the hatred, some of the racism is very similar to what they suffer from. And moreover, for many of them, that there are connections between their own histories and our history. And these are things that can obviously have to be developed, but it's an encouraging phenomenon. So this is the second thing I think is important. The third thing I think is important, and it's linked to the first thing I said, is that there's been a major change on college campuses. When I was an undergraduate, which is a very, very long time ago, Golda Meir, who was at that stage, I think, the foreign minister of Israel, she was about to become prime minister. In fact, she might have been prime minister. She was foreign minister. She came to speak on my campus. There were hundreds of delirious students there to welcome her. There were 4 of us protesting. Me, a Sudanese graduate student, a Lebanese American friend of mine, and a white guy. 4 people. So it was 4 against 500. I mean, we were not against them. We were, we were a tiny little group. That's not the case on American college campuses today. Here at Columbia, students, over 1,000 of whom voted, by about a 2/3 vote, voted to support divestment of Columbia from companies that support the occupation. Same thing happened at Barnard College. Same thing happened at Brown. Same thing has happened at universities in California. Same thing happened at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. This is a new world on college campuses. We are actually winning elections. I mean, in campuses which include large numbers of Jewish students, very few Arab or Muslim students, limited numbers of minority students, this is not our people who are voting. These are ordinary students who are voting in favor of BDS. And so the situation on college campuses has really been transformed. This is a function of the change I talked about in youth, but it's also a function of hard work by a lot of students, a lot of student activists. Some of them Arab American, many of them just ordinary white kids, and many of them Jewish students. And I'll come back to that in a minute. It's linked, that change on campuses is linked to a shift in academia. You couldn't find a decent book on Palestine when I was a kid. You couldn't find a decent book on Palestine. If they existed, they were hard to find. Okay? Today, the Academy is full of excellent work on Palestine. There are literally dozens of monographs that arrive in my mailbox every year. Dozens, 20, 30, more. There are dozens of novels, memoirs, poetry, plays on Palestine being published, being performed, films, all kinds of art. There is an explosion in the cultural sphere and in the academic sphere of work on Palestine. This never happened before. This is brand new. And this means anybody, Zionist, anti-Zionist, a person who knows or doesn't know, who studies the subject will be obliged, or is able at least, and very likely to be obliged, to look at material that will open their eyes. The Journal of Palestine Studies, which I co-edit with Shireen Sayedi, she and I are the co-editors, has hundreds of thousands of downloads of articles every year. Over 200,000 downloads a year. Those are graduate students and undergraduates and activists who are downloading a couple 100,000 articles every single year. So people are writing academic papers based on reliable work, based on serious, objective scholarship on Palestine, much of it by Palestinians or other Arabs, some of it by other people, Europeans, Americans, whatever. So that's the third change, what's happening on college campuses and what's happening in academia. The fourth change is a change in the Jewish community. And if you look at the big institutions that purport to represent the Jewish community, you of course don't see any change. You know, the Conference of Presidents, Zionist Organization of America, the ADL, none of these big, powerful groups that represent the older, more established, wealthier members of the community, none of them have changed. But if you look at public opinion polling, if you look at the younger members of the community, enormous, enormous changes are taking place. There is a distance from Israel among younger people especially, which never existed before, never before. There's a willingness to listen to criticism of Israel, a willingness to listen to the Palestinian narrative that you never had before. Now that has created a backlash. I'll talk about that backlash in a minute. That has meant that the powerful individuals and groups that dominate community relations in the Jewish community have redoubled their efforts to propagandize, to shut down debate, and so on and so forth. But they are doing this because they feel they're losing their younger generation. And I think we have to see that dialectically. It's not just that they're trying to destroy BDS. It's not just that they're trying to smear Palestinian activism by calling it anti-Semitic. It's because there have been so many successes that they are obliged to resort to these extreme measures. The fifth thing I want to talk about is the change that's taking place at the base of the Democratic Party. And it's a function of all the things I've talked about. Changes in the Jewish community, changes among minorities, a greater activism among Palestinians and Arabs, which I haven't talked about yet, and the changes among younger people and among liberals generally in this country. The polling is very, very clear. The base of the Democratic Party is more critical of Israel than it has ever been in the past. The base of the Democratic Party is more willing to consider issues of Palestinian rights than it ever was in the past. The platform of the Democratic Party is still shaped by the leadership, which is Zionist and pro-Israel. But if you talk to people who were at the convention in 2016 or 2020, the floor was with us, even though the leadership made sure that the resolutions that were passed were the standard pro-Israel planks of the Democratic Party platform. There has been a shift at the base, and it's an ongoing shift at the base of the Democratic Party. That's linked to something else. It's linked to the fact that for the first time in the entire history of the United States, there actually is a significant group of legislators who are supportive in some measure of Palestinian rights. Betty McCollum had 24 co-sponsors for her bill on Israel's detention of children. Every single one of them was opposed by the lobby. Every single one of them was reelected in 2020. And a half dozen others, Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, several other people were elected on platforms in which they said we support Palestinian rights, in which they said we're in favor of curtailing American funding of Israel, in which they said things that no American politician has said before and survived. So we had 24 before the 2020 elections. There are probably 30 or 35 or more people who have a position that no American politicians as a group ever had from the time of Woodrow Wilson until today. And there's about a half dozen senators, Van Hollen, Sanders, obviously, a couple of others who are with that group. I'll talk about the leadership of the party and why it is so reactionary on this issue in a minute. I want to talk about a couple of other things. I don't want to go into too much detail. I see that I've already gone on for almost half an hour. So I'll try and be a little quicker. Another thing that has really changed is especially younger people, but more and more people are less reliant on mainstream corporate media and are more reliant on non-mainstream media or social media. And that is a bad thing and a good thing. But it used to be that you were fed a constant drip of lies by the mainstream corporate media. And that's all you could get. Unless you knew Arabic, unless you traveled to the Middle East, there was no way for you to know better. Today, there are ways for people to know better. And especially young people are using that. And that is an enormous asset. It means that we can do information for our cause in ways that simply would have been impossible. You could pay for an ad in the New York Times, but there was no other way to get into the New York Times. It doesn't really matter anymore if you can get into the New York Times, or at least it doesn't matter as much because of non-traditional media and social media. The last two things I want to talk about, or the last thing I want to talk about, is the fact that activism in the Palestinian community, in the Arab community, in the Muslim community, has finally reached the level where I think it is actually making a difference, where it's impacting on American politics, but it's also impacting on our communities, not just our communities internally, but the communities that we live among. We are now beginning to be seen as a group that has to be taken seriously. In Virginia, groups of donors bundled and went to people who were candidates for the lower house in Virginia and said, if you oppose this anti-BDS bill, we will give you money. And candidate after candidate said, okay, we'll oppose it, we'll take your money. And they did oppose it, and the bill didn't pass. This is the way politics works in the United States. And there are more and more communities, Houston, the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., the south suburbs of Chicago, where a candidate was elected, defeated Lipinski, one of the most Zionist members of Congress. I'm forgetting her name, Marie, I'm forgetting her name. And she ran on a pro-Palestinian platform. Well, the southwest side of Chicago is where the largest Palestinian American community in Illinois lives. Same thing is true in the Bay Area. There are several other regions that you guys in New Jersey know what I'm talking about. It's another one of the major Arab American, Muslim American, and Palestinian American communities in this country. We have a woman running for DA in Manhattan, Abir Abushi. I hope she wins, but even if she doesn't, when did a Palestinian run for DA in Manhattan? It's going to be a tough row to hoe, I think, for her and for many other candidates. But the fact that people are putting themselves out there in this way is an indication of a really major change. Now, the last thing I want to say about the present is that, yes, it's true that there are all these positive trends, but it's also true that there has been a powerful backlash. There is a powerful backlash against BDS. There's a powerful backlash against any activism on Palestine. The former is taking the form of attacks on people on campus, legal attacks, and attacks through putting pressure on administrations to shut down events. The latter is taking place through an attempt to get the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism adopted by various bodies. Now, these are negative trends. There's no way to describe them otherwise, but they are an indication of the changes that I'm talking about. If it weren't for all these positive changes, I promise you, they would not be resorting to these desperate measures. They would not be hiring hundreds of lawyers all over the country to fight. They would not be spending tens and tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars on campus events, on community events, on all kinds of efforts, online efforts to smear students, to do a variety of things that are intended to dislocate these positive developments. And I think we have to learn about these campaigns. We have to learn about what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism is, what's wrong with it. And we have, in order to combat these things, we have to understand them. We have to understand who's behind these campaigns. We have to understand why these campaigns are taking place. And we, I think, have to combat them in another way, which is to combat every form of racism, every form of bigotry, whether that's anti-Black, whether it's anti-Muslim, whether it's anti-Semitic. That's something we have to combat within our own communities. We have racism within our own communities. We have attitudes towards Black people. We have attitudes towards Latino people. Some of us have attitudes towards Jews that are not acceptable, that are frankly a hindrance to our development and our progress as a community. We have to combat those things, and we have to see that combating them makes us natural allies. If we are really vigorous in opposing the kind of racism, systemic racism that Black people have been subject to ever since they were brought over to this country, most of them as slaves, we have natural allies there. And the same is true in other communities. That's all I wanted to say about the present. Let me talk very briefly about the future. As I said at the beginning, as a historian, I'm ill-equipped to talk about the future. The joke I make is that the job description of a historian does not include predicting the future. I cannot predict the future. I will not predict the future. Also, I am acutely aware that positive trends can change over time, but also that negative ones can disappear overnight. I'm aware that public opinion can change very, very rapidly. Biden is now popular. He's a man who had an almost zero population rating before he ran. The man has a positive approval rating, something that Trump never had for the entirety of his presidency. That can change. Public opinion is fickle, and public opinion is volatile. Trends can change over time. So I'm not gonna predict anything, but I'm gonna just say that I think that our future as Palestinians and as Palestinian Americans is dependent on some things that we can do something about and some things that we can't do things about. For example, the future of Palestine, in my view, is in large part dependent on whether the Palestinian national movement can be resuscitated, whether Palestinian unity can be reestablished, and frankly, there is only a limited amount that we can do to affect this situation. We should try to affect it. I think that it is our responsibility, it's our duty, in fact, to try and affect it. But I think we have to recognize that ultimately it's going to be Palestinians closer to Palestine who are going to have the major share in it. In my view, we and other people in the Shitat must have a voice in these matters. But ultimately, that's something that has to be done by all Palestinians. It's not going to be done by Palestinian Americans. Okay? It has to be done by all Palestinians. And it can't be done, certainly, by the leaderships living under occupation alone. They are not representative of all of us. We never elected them. Okay? The so-called Palestinian Authority, whatever limited authority it has, is based on a vote 16 years ago, which didn't include us. So we should have a voice in these matters, not the decisive voice. Ultimately, we're not the ones who will decide. But this is essential. And this is something that going into the future, I think we should, how should I say, throw our weight into. Our future here in this country, however, is much more in our hands. Some of the circumstances in which we live are out of our control, but we can have influence over many of them. And in time, perhaps we can control a lot of circumstances. We have to do things like I think Palestinian American Community Center is doing, which is to organize our community, which is to organize events like this. I mean, you guys are one of my ideals. The Arab American Action Network in Chicago is another ideal group. There are a few activist mosques I know of. There are a few activist churches I know of. There are other organizations, village organizations. But there are many, many other levels on which we can and should organize. The young people in SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, have a fantastic national network. It's loose. It has no central. One reason it's so hard for them to smash it is because it doesn't have a hierarchy. It's essentially just the students on every campus and they're networking. Networks are so much harder to destroy than pyramids. And that's one reason they've had so much trouble. And that's one reason it's so resilient and it's so effective. So we have organizations, many of them. We need more. We need to organize more. We need to work harder. We have to become even more involved than we already are in our local politics. It's not enough to be involved in our own communities. We have to reach out. If we want people to help us and to support us, we have to help them and support them. That's a hard thing to do because our community has problems. Our community faces all kinds of prejudice. I understand that. But you will not get support from other people unless you reach your hand out to them and say, we understand that you too face hardships. You too face prejudice. That's true in Patterson. That's true on the south side of Chicago. That's true in the neighborhoods that I know in Brooklyn. And it's hard. Many people in our community are not as assimilated as some of the younger people are in American life. Many of them don't feel comfortable doing this. But as more and more of us, more and more young people get educated, get integrated, understand how this society works, I think we have to do this. It is actually the future. And that means we have to reach out to people who, frankly, are the only progressive elements in American society in some cases. Members of some of these minorities are the, or I should say not the only ones, the most progressive elements in American society. I obviously can't predict the future, but I think that the present involves a lot of really positive trends. I am actually extremely optimistic. I think that if we push for expanding and continuing the positive trends that I talked about, if we combat some of the negative things that are going on, if we struggle within the Democratic Party, for example, against the leadership, which is completely out of tune with the base of the party. There was a question in the chat, I saw it come up quickly. Why are the Schumers and Pelosi's so pro-Israel? They're so pro-Israel because, for one thing, they're much older. They're people in their 80s and 70s. They came to consciousness at a time when Zionism was extremely positively viewed throughout American political life. And they depend on money. And all of the, not all, a very large proportion of the biggest donors, people like Haim Saban to the Democratic Party, are committed to Israel. It's their first concern and interest. That and their age and their conservatism explains why the leadership of the party is where it is. That can be changed. And that's something that, one of many, many things, not just Palestinian Americans who are going to change that, obviously. It has to be changed by many people because these people are opposed to many progressive measures. They represent corporate interests, they represent traditional interventionist American foreign policies, and they represent a blind support for Israel. And that's out of tune with most of the Democratic base. So we have to be part of that struggle, and we have to be a part of struggles at a local level. As I've said, I can't predict the future, but I think if we continue to push for the positive trends that I've talked about and try and see to it that they continue and they develop, and if we continue to struggle against the negative trends, I believe that we have a bright future both as Palestinian Americans and as Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi, for that very powerful keynote. We're all very grateful to you for your insight, which certainly really lends credence and weight to the work that we all do, both as individuals and collectively. It's very reassuring to know that we have so many assets in our arsenal, both as individuals, again, and collectively, from our youth to the intersectional connections and movement building that we're working on, to also the growing resources that we have at our very own fingertips these days. I, for one, will never forget when I was assigned to read Palestinian Identity as a graduate student, how validating really that was for me as the only Palestinian in my program, and how simultaneously uncomfortable that made so many of my other classmates who were really, they have an agenda of their own, and they were trying to perpetuate their own myths. And so, having that book being assigned as part of my syllabus, I'm forever grateful for that, and for so many others.
You should thank your teacher for assigning it.
Well, that's another conversation. Because, the view had to be balanced. So we'll talk about that later. But I want to transition into the Q&A portion. So thank you so much. One of the questions already that Dr. Khalidi addressed was that why are leaders like Pelosi and Schumer so reluctant to accept this change of accepting Palestinian rights? So I think that unless you have something more to say about that, I'll move on to another question. Another question is, would you be able to share the Palestinian migration to Latin America and the influence on culture and I guess the influence that that had on culture in Latin America. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I'm obviously not an expert on migration, Palestinian or Arab migration to Latin America, which is a big subject. We've published a number of articles on it in the Journal of Palestine Studies. But my son lives in Chile, and I've been there several times. And probably the largest Palestinian community outside of the Arab world lives in Chile. And these communities, Chile and in Central America especially, but also in Colombia and a couple of other Latin American countries, constitute an enormous asset, which unfortunately has not really been utilized by the Palestinian National Movement. Back in the days when the PLO was still vigorous, there were attempts to mobilize these communities. I don't think anything serious has been done for many years to do that. I think that they could have an enormous role. In Chile, the numbers are hard to come by. I have friends who work in the Centro de Estudios Árabes in the University of Santiago, and they say the estimates of the Palestinian community in Chile, for example, range from about 250,000 to 500,000. And the interesting thing about that community is that, first of all, they're very old immigrants. That is to say, some of them arrived in Chile in the 1880s and 90s, before World War I. There was a Palestinian football club in Chile, Club Palestino, in 1921. So you have a large, well-rooted, highly assimilated Palestinian community in Chile. There have been new additions to the community. There are many new immigrants, but the bulk of the community is well established. They're Spanish speaking, they're integrated, they're extremely prominent in Chilean society.
Dr. Khalidi, may I? As a matter of fact, Palestino is still in the first tier of the Chilean soccer league. Professional.
I know that. I have a Club Palestino cap and shirt.
Look at that. Look at that.
I know. I know. Thank you. But more than that, I really can't say. I mean, this is an enormous potential asset.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in is, as college students, how can we both push our faculty to make Palestine part of the curriculum and support faculty members who face repercussions because of their views on Palestine? For example, like what's been happening in Harvard.
Yeah. As far as students are concerned, the faculty question is harder to answer. As far as students are concerned, students have rights. And they have legal rights, and they can have recourse, I should say, to legal support from Palestine Legal, which is an organization that was set up to support student and faculty activists around the Palestine issue. So if you know of any students that are having trouble, either being harassed or in particular are having trouble with their administrations, I strongly suggest that you contact Palestine Legal. They're overwhelmed with work, but that is their job. And if any of you have any extra money, you should contribute to Palestine Legal because they are supporting 6 lawyers, and that's a lot of that takes. Think about a lawyer's salary. They're movement lawyers, so they're not getting corporate salaries, but it costs a lot, and they do an enormous amount of work. They're fighting the Fordham case even now. They're supporting students in California. They're supporting students all over the country. They have several lawyers in California, several lawyers in Chicago. I think 2 or maybe today 3 in New York, covering the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West. So for students there, and for faculty as well, there is that recourse. But you know, I tell my own graduate students, my own PhD students, you have to understand that if you feel a responsibility to include Palestine in your curriculum, you have to be prepared for the consequences. And, you know, I never was afraid of those consequences, and I can describe my own experiences in the past. But more and more faculty members are willing to pay those consequences. And in some cases, in some universities, the environment is more favorable, certainly among arts and sciences faculty, among professors of English, history, anthropology, there's often support. Among the professional schools and among the administration, there's much less support. And remember, what I said about the leadership of the Democratic Party applies both to public and private universities. Private universities are dependent on donations. and big donors, many of them feel strongly about Israel, supportive of Israel. And administrators are terrified of alienating big money. So this is a problem. Faculty don't care as much about that. State universities are dependent on state legislatures, and state legislatures, as we know, can often be very biased where the issue of Palestine is concerned. So this is something we can fight in places like Michigan and New Jersey, where we actually have, and in Virginia, where we actually have representatives who we can speak to. This can be fought. I mean, you have a senator in Michigan, Van Hollen, who's very sympathetic, and you have several representatives in Michigan who are very sympathetic. So University of Michigan, Michigan State, Wayne State are universities that are dependent on the legislature of Michigan. And this is something that can be fought by our communities, not just by students or faculty. But it can be very hard. I know several people who've lost their jobs because of Palestine, several colleagues at different universities. It is a tough fight. But I have to say this, we're winning.
Yeah. A follow-up question, I think, that has to do with party politics or partisan politics is, do you think that some of that within the some of the work, I guess, within the Democratic Party or the rhetoric is performative, and that there's a push to fall into the status quo of being pro-Zionist? The lobbying pockets run deep, APAC and amongst others. It happened with Warnock. He flipped pretty much 180 from being pro-Palestine, pro-Zionist.
Right. I mean, if you want to have the most penetrating view of how strong that influence is, you should listen to a podcast that Peter Beinart did with Ben Rhodes, who worked in the Obama administration on Iran and issues and Middle East issues generally. It is the most frank portrayal of abusive influence on behalf of Israel exerted on people in an administration that I've ever seen. And it's true what somebody mentioned, Warnock in Georgia, and it's true in many cases. That people are intimidated, and they know perfectly well that the positions that they're forced to take don't represent their beliefs, and they go ahead and do it. On the other hand, there are districts all over this country where all the money in the world is not going to unseat the representative or the senator. And so they're not afraid of lobbying. They're not afraid of hostile campaigns. They're not afraid. And those are the kinds of things we have to build on. So it's really easy to fall into a funk and become depressed with a story like the Warnock story, or listening to the podcast that Peter Beinart did with Ben Rhodes. On the other hand, look at the dozens, literally couple of dozen, 2-3 dozen members of the House of Representatives who are not afraid and who are in secure districts where nothing can be done to unseat them as far as the Palestine issue is concerned. So, the glass is half empty and the glass is half full. And money is really important. And in some districts, not that much money. I bet you there are districts in New Jersey. I know that there are districts in New York where an organized community could actually maybe not tip the scales, but have an impact on the scales by bundling and forcefully making their views known. We don't expect you to do X, Y, and Z, but you have to do at least A and B. And if you do, we will be loyal supporters. We have to be realistic as well. I mean, I'd really like to see them defund Israel. Ain't gonna happen. But passing Betty McCollum's bill, not likely to happen, but a little more likely than stopping $3.8 billion a year going to the Israeli war machine.
Yeah, I think it's always useful to be a PACC optimist in that sense.
As Amir Habibi would have put it.
Yeah, exactly. To be, see the glass half full and yet half empty at the same time. Another question is, Dr. Khalidi, how do you see the elections in Palestine? And how would that affect our advocacy here? I think that alludes to something.
That's a really good question, because there are so many aspects of it. One of the problems that we have as advocates of the Palestine cause and as Arabs and as Muslims is that the image of our part of the world is negative, in some cases for illegitimate reasons, racist reasons, but in some cases for legitimate reasons. I mean, the Arab world is a black hole where democracy is concerned. it is the least democratic region of the world. Now, there are all kinds of external reasons for that, but there are also internal reasons for that. And it's something that Israel has systematically played on. The only democracy in the Middle East, the only democracy. I mean, how many times have I heard that? 1 million, 80 million, 100 million? We've all heard it. Well, as it happens, Israel rules over more than half of the population it rules over has never had any democratic rights since it occupied the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. So it's actually not a democracy, but that's another question. Peddling itself as the sole democracy in the Middle East in a region which has a huge democratic deficit actually is an asset for them. Okay, they peddle themselves as a democracy. I've just said they're not really, but that's not the point. Leaving aside discrimination against Palestinians inside Israel, they rule over almost 5 million Palestinians who have no rights whatsoever. And they're the sole sovereign over the territory. But we can do something about our own house, which is the Palestinian house. Maybe we can't do anything here because they're not going to let us vote here. We're not voting in the Palestinian Legislative Council elections for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But I think that on the one hand, any elections would probably be a good thing. I am not sure that these elections will actually be conducted freely and fairly. I'm not sure they will even take place. I'm afraid that the two political factions that dominate Palestinian politics, both of which, in my view, are completely bankrupt, have nothing to offer, have no real constructive program for liberation, both of which are mainly devoted to self-preservation and preservation of their prerogatives and their privileges as rulers of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, respectively, under Israeli occupation. So they're subcontractors for an occupation. And unfortunately, they're content with that. Neither of these groups, in my view, has a strategy for liberation. So this is unfortunate. And if there is an election, it may well be based on some kind of arcane agreement between them. Still, any election, in my view, might have a positive outcome, partly because they can plot and plan, but if people are allowed to vote, and if the vote is free, the outcome may be different than what they're plotting and planning. And secondly, because it will give us a renewed image as a people that has had a democratic election. And I think that's a very important thing. Now, people in this country are perfectly capable of ignoring the fact that Tunisia and Lebanon and Kuwait actually are countries with democracies, relatively unlimited democracy. Now, Lebanon is one of the most corrupt democracies on earth, but it is a democracy. It's a country where there has been a constitutional change of government ever since 1943. Uninterrupted in spite of war, invasion, civil war, external intervention. Kuwait has a relatively free electoral system, which is actually capable of bringing down a government. It has a free press. It has political parties. It has freedom of speech. It's not an ideal democracy. The ruling family has much too much power. I could go on about the problems of Kuwaiti democracy. Tunisia has massive problems, but there are several democracies in the Arab world. But those are almost the only three countries. If we were to have elections, in my view, it would be a good thing, even though I have grave doubts about the form of the election and about the two major political forces.
Thank you. Dr. Khalidi, could you, or can we discuss the recent comments made by Secretary of State Tony Blinken about the ICC's investigation into Israeli war crimes? On that note, what role does the UN Security Council play in overlooking the ongoing violations Israel is committing?
Yeah, I just saw Blinken's, I saw the Haaretz report of Blinken's comments to the House Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. And they're very depressing. They're depressing on Iran. They're depressing on BDS. They're depressing on the Taylor Force Act. They're depressing on the ICC. We have a Secretary of State who is in the mold of some of his least distinguished predecessors. He's as bad as Hillary. He's as bad as Madeleine. He's as bad as Warren Christopher. He's not quite as bad as Pompeo, but in the same league. So we're going to have another rough ride with this Secretary of State. He is a committed Zionist. He believes in things that many of us know to be perfectly false. And that's going to be a problem, because even though some of the people around him, some of the people in the NSC, around the president, actually know better, they're going to be swimming uphill, just as Ben Rhodes was in the Obama White House. They're going to be facing a incredible storm coming at them when they try and do the right thing on Iran, or they try and do the right thing on Palestine, or they try and do the right thing in Syria or wherever else it may be. So I think it's extremely depressing. It's not entirely surprising, however. The United States has the same attitude towards the ICC as far as it's concerned as it does towards ICC jurisdiction over Israel. The United States is terrified of international law being applied to its soldiers, its diplomats, its decision makers, for the same reason the Israelis are terrified, because they could be brought before a court for grave violations of human rights, for war crimes, for whatever it might be. And so their position is driven not just by fealty to the Israel lobby, in fact, not mainly by that, but by the American position on the ICC, which is we don't want to see an ICC. If there has to be an ICC, let it judge Africans, but let us leave us white people alone. Let us leave the empire. Let it leave the empire alone. That's the attitude of the United States to the ICC. I should say one other thing about the Security Council. The United Nations was created by the United States. I am currently reading a book by a graduate student who just finished at Columbia, entitled Tomorrow of the World, which lays this out in greater detail than I've ever seen before. His name is Stephen Wertheim, W-E-R-T-H-E-I-M. And he makes it entirely clear that the structure of the United States, the structure of the United Nations, and in particular, the Security Council, was designed by Americans in order to preserve or to extend American influence and domination in the post-World War II era. That's what it did. It's what it was meant to do. It was meant to give the United States and other great powers. At that time, the United States saw Britain as its equal. As time went on, it came to see it as a junior partner. The Soviet Union for a brief period while they were allies, and ultimately the United States by itself as the determining actor through the Security Council in the United Nations. My father worked for the UN for his whole life. My brother worked for the UN for his whole career. I went to the United Nations International School here in New York, and I know a great deal about the UN. That is what the UN does. The UN does not represent the world of the United Nations. The UN predominantly represents the great powers, and particularly the greatest power. It was designed to do that. That's what it does. We should not expect justice. We should not expect peace from the Security Council unless that happens to be what the United States and the other permanent members, the other great powers, desire.
Dr. Khalidi, could you speak about the disheartening effect on the individual spirit and the spirit of a community when it comes to, when we hear of Zionist advocacy and we know that at its base it's a lie?
I don't think we should be dispirited, frankly. We know that it's a lie, and increasing numbers of people are seeing through it. And I don't think we should be at all despairing about that. It's irritating more than anything. I mean, I pick up the New York Times and I'm furious sometimes in the morning. But thank God, fewer and fewer people read the damn thing. Thank God there are other outlets, other sources of information, other media. There weren't 50 years ago. There weren't 30 years ago. We're in a new world as far as that's concerned. So yes, they peddle their lies. Yes, some of those falsehoods have been turned into law by a compliant Congress. Yes, we have an administration which operates on lies like the lie of Israeli security. Israeli security encompasses the ability to bomb capitals from Tehran to Tunis. I just read a credible report that they were going to bomb Algiers during the 1988 Mejlis Watani, Palestinian National Congress. They have bombed 8 Arab capitals. That's Israeli security. They can kill almost 2,000 Palestinian civilians in Gaza in 2014. That's Israeli security. They can do that using American weapons that are only supposed to be used for self-defense by US law, and they can violate that law with impunity. That's frustrating. That's irritating. More and more people are coming to understand, however, that some of these things are lies. And I think that's where you have to take your solace.
Thank you. We've come to our final question, and that is, what do you think is the key difference between the United States and many European states who sometimes lean more and are more sympathetic and understanding of Palestinians?
Yeah, I was on this is my second Zoom conference of the day. I was on a conference with the University of Bologna in Italy, and I was asked that same question. It's a good question. Europe and Russia and India and China, all of which are major powers and will be bigger powers in the 21st century than they are today, all are more dependent on Middle Eastern energy and on transit through the Middle East than is the United States. Maybe transit, the United States is more dependent or as dependent, but energy, the United States is self-sufficient in energy. American energy corporations want to make a profit in the Middle East, but so do other corporations. But the United States is not dependent on Middle Eastern energy. Europe is. It's dependent partly on Russian gas, but mainly on Middle Eastern energy. Same is true with India. Same is true with China. That's not true, of course, of Russia. Russia is a major energy exporter. But Russia is close to the region, and Russia has interests in the region. All of them, I think, can be expected at some time in the future to have a deeper involvement in the Middle East, and therefore sooner or later in the Palestine question. That may be good, it may be bad. Unfortunately, the Arab world has done very little to cultivate these growing powers of the 21st century. Unfortunately, Israel has done a great deal to cultivate these growing powers of the 21st century. Israel has extraordinarily good relations with Russia, excellent relations with India, very good relations with China, very good relations with a number of large Latin American countries, and very good relations with a number of African countries and a number of Eastern European countries. It has been active, intelligent, forceful, and proactive, in fact. And we've been asleep at the switch. Once upon a time, we had active diplomacy. We had more successful diplomacy than Israel for a couple of decades, actually. We outvoted them in the General Assembly year after year after year. And that is a success that I think we should look at. We should look at failures and mistakes. We should also look at successes and victories. As far as Europe specifically is concerned, the issue is this. Europe was originally, the EU, what is now the EU, was originally created as a coal and steel community, and it became a trading bloc. It was primarily meant to be an economic organization. And it still is primarily an economic organization. Insofar as it has some kind of political presence in the world, it's entirely dependent on unanimity among its 27 now members, now that Britain has left. And the problem here is that whereas there used to be a sort of north-south split with Ireland together with the southern European countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and a few others, more supportive of the Palestinians, and Germany, Holland, and some of the Scandinavian countries less supportive of the Palestinians. Today, you have a fifth column of authoritarian, nationalist, right-wing regimes that are marching in lockstep with Israel. In Hungary, in Poland, and a couple of other Eastern European countries, you have extremely right-wing governments which see eye to eye with Netanyahu and the Israeli government. They're Islamophobes, they're racists, they're authoritarians. They love Netanyahu because he's just like them. And they love Israel's foreign policy. And they are a fifth column inside of Europe. And Europe can't do anything without unanimity. The Germans and the French, if they decide to do something, and they can recruit the Italians and the Spanish, or whoever it may be, constitute an important bloc. And they can push the EU. And they can act outside of the EU. And sometimes they do. But you have problems there as well. France, you have this extraordinary Islamophobia. In Britain, both political parties have very powerful Israel lobbies within them. The Conservative Party is very pro-Israel. And the Labour Party, with the defeat of Corbyn, has shifted way over to the right on the question of Palestine. So Europe is less likely to take a knee-jerk position supportive of Israel. But Europe, first of all, is divided, as I suggested. And secondly, and this is very important, Europe has only a limited number of issues that it's willing to go up against the United States on. Now, Macron has been pushing for a more independent European position on defense and on other issues. We'll see when Merkel is replaced whether the Germans will go along with this. When and if that happens, there still remains the question, is this the hill that the Europeans want to die on in a confrontation with the United States? Do they really want to fight over Palestine? They have bigger fish to fry, I'm afraid, common defense policy, policy on Russia. I could go on and on, and migration from the Middle East and Africa to Europe. These are big issues for them, foreign policy issues, probably bigger than Palestine. Nevertheless, the Europeans are much, much better than the United States in many respects, in labeling products produced in the occupied territories as such, and in putting pressure on Israel on a variety of things. I don't know how much more we can expect of them. I think we should all be watching the German elections next year. That'll be very important, and also watch how Orban and the Polish and other governments, how long they're able to stay in power. A fall of an authoritarian government in any of those countries would very much weaken that strong Eastern European pro-Israel bloc in the EU.
Well, regardless of what hill they decide to live or die on, I certainly know what hill most of us want to be on. So thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi, for that really insightful and powerful presentation, and for your time that you graciously gave us this evening. We are so grateful to you.
It's a pleasure. There's no organization I would rather speak to.